Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Kim.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. Bob, good to be with you again. Just a moment ago, we were talking a little bit about the podcast itself just before we flipped on the mics here. And I thought it was just a really beautiful discussion of us just sharing a little bit about our hearts. And I thought, let's bring the listeners into that. And we were kind of talking about how our hope is for people when they listen to the podcast that they would just be blessed and that they would experience the Spirit moving in their lives in the areas that are needing healing. Anything you want to add to that or anything you want to share about that?
Well, personally, this is a new medium for me. I know you've been doing it for a while, but I'm used to speaking to a group where I can interact and see and experience the relationship. Even as a therapist, there's a relational dynamic going on there, and you can see and feel and experience and move with. And in this, there's not that, and so
Right.
It just leaves you in a question of I pray that the things that we're sharing are reaching the hearts of the people who are listening.
That's so true. We were chuckling because we can see each other's faces and what we're saying to each other resonates, but we have no idea if it's resonating with anybody else. But all I can say is, Bob, I like what you're saying. And I think that's the prayer, is that we're hoping that it moves past Bob and I, right? So listeners, we just hope that it's blessing you, because we get each other and this is kind of normal talk for us. But anyway, we'll just keep trusting it to the Spirit and keep moving forward. So we're still in our series on the theology of the body. And so if you're wondering, why are they spending so much time on the theology of the body? Well, if you want to understand healing, and if you want to know what healing's like, you have to have an anthropology, which means an understanding of the human person. What is a person supposed to look like? What's fully healed even look like? Well, the theology of the body gives us that. And so for Bob and I, this is a central piece of healing, is having an anthropology that lays a foundation, a background for healing. And so that's why we're going through this whole series. And so today we're on the experience of original nakedness or original innocence. And the wounded part of that would be shame. And so, boy, Bob, if there's a concept that is all over the place, it's shame. Our quote for today comes from Genesis 2, verse 25. Genesis chapter 2, verse 25. The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Again, talk about John Paul II. He's one verse, and that guy can draw out 100 pages of depth and beauty and etc. So this is kind of the experience before the fall, naked without shame. So one caveat, we're not talking just about physical nakedness. And I think, again, that's what our culture has gotten us to see through this lens. In my therapy world, no one has ever taken their physical clothes off, and that's appropriate and good. But there has been incredible amounts of spiritual and emotional vulnerability. And it's right there where so much healing has happened, where people are concerned that if they show these broken parts of us, that they're going to get shamed by someone else.
Yeah.
And so what we're really dialing into with the healing parts here are about the emotional nakedness, the spiritual nakedness, the nakedness of the memory that they might remember or experience. Anything comes out for you with that quote?
Yeah, the first is kind of a humorous experience. One of my first clients did disrobe in front of me, a man.
Okay, that's a story that I feel like has to be shared. Obviously, he had a lot that was going on in his life.
He was rejected as a young man in the locker room, and he was telling me about the story, and he wanted to be affirmed in his masculinity, and I freaked out. I was like, "Put your clothes back on."
Understandably. Right?
Actually, I'm working on a book right now called "Be Not Ashamed."
I thought you were about to say I'm working on a book called "In the Locker Room."
No, but I tell his story. So,
oh, do you?
Yeah,
okay.
I tell the story of that.
That's a beautiful. I mean, if we break down that, like at face value, you go, "Gosh, that guy's really messed up." Well, that's not our world. Our world is to go right into those places of brokenness for him.
Yeah.
Look at the ache.
Yeah.
To have his nakedness physically, in this sense, not be ashamed.
Yeah.
Right? To be affirmed.
Yep. To be affirmed in his physical nature.
Yeah.
And as you're saying, I mean, you just said it very well, of what we experience all the time in therapy is people, in effect, opening themselves, going past the shame, and revealing who they are in the places where they've been in shame. And it gives us a glimpse into this original innocence. It's the beauty of vulnerability in its purest sense, appropriate opening in
Mm,
the face of being received. And when we're received, when we're seen for who we are, it's safe to do that.
that is so true. I mean, the experience here is seeing as God sees.
Yeah.
And that's again, what we talked about last episode, that distortion that can happen from our experiences, and then we don't see God rightly. That catechism quote, paragraph 239, is seeing rightly is a really nice way to put this dynamic with original nakedness, and then naked without shame, and then the experience of shame is, how do people see me, and how do I see others? And it's this whole concept of, again, not just physical seeing, although that's a part of it,
Mm.
but also the spiritual seeing. And I have to say, that's probably the greatest honor that I've ever received in therapy, is to have somebody feel safe enough to let me see their vulnerability. And it's sacred, sacred ground.
Yeah.
I regularly say in my practice, I just want to slow down and honor what you're doing right now, because sometimes they just, please help me. They're so desperate, like the guy you were talking about. And it's like, let's just reverence what you're doing here, you
Yeah,
know?
reverence is a good word for it. I think that's the original innocence. There's such a reverence for God
Mm,
and each other that Adam and Eve have, that they can see each other rightly, and
right,
they haven't yet sinned, so they're not carrying any shame, so
right.
that they can just mutually see and reveal themselves, which is intimacy, which is the thing that our hearts long for, just to see and be seen, to be known and to know and to accept and to be accepted. I mean, that's so core to the
Yes.
deepest needs that we have.
It's so true. The analogy comes up of a child. And so if we use the analogy of a child, meaning a child who's had a great upbringing, and they're little, let's let that relate to not having wounds. And what is that child, they'll just take their clothes off and start running around,
Yeah,
right? And they'll look right at you and go, "Hey, how's it going? How's your day?" And they don't have any clothes on because they don't have the experience of shame. And so there's an element of freedom, right?
yeah,
And so
yeah,
we have to obviously, parent our children to say, okay, that's not totally, we live in a fallen world, but there's a little glimpse there that we see about the heart, about what our hearts can be. I long for the day, and God, please let it come soon, where I can stand there and have just made a giant mistake, and that's naked, and just go, well, all right, okay, just keep moving on. There's a freedom there in being seen, even in my failure, and knowing that I'm okay.
yeah.
That's an example to me of healed, but
That's a redeemed place, and, what we're talking about in original innocence is that place where we're not even prone to make mistakes because there's no sin, and so what's that like? Can we even imagine
yeah,
what
that
what it's
sounds
like
awesome.
what it's like to be sinless in that way? It's just the freedom of heart that's there, being without sin, being without shame, being without needing to protect ourselves from somebody else. I mean, just talk about the longings of our hearts, and the place that we can begin to experience that is with God. But on his end, it's safe. On our end, it doesn't feel safe because of what our history's brought. When you're talking about the little kids running around naked, for whatever reason, each of my grandsons has had this stage around 2, 3 years old where they take off their diapers and they run around, they beat their chest, and it's naked boy, naked boy. But it's
Yep.
totally unashamed. It's totally
Yeah.
unself-conscious.
Yes.
And there's this freedom just to, here is who I am.
What's beautiful about that is that, so this is where you and I dial into these human experiences. In those experiences, what I find is beautiful is that the child is often looking right in the face of
Yeah,
the other.
yeah,
They're looking right in their eyes, which is this really vulnerable thing, and just going, "You see me, don't you?"
yeah,
"Yeah, and I'm okay."
yeah.
And it's this beautiful, right? Like the pounding of the chest, and it's an element of joy, right?
Mhm.
Looking at grandpa right in the face and going, "Do you see me?
Yeah.
I know. This is great, and it's this beautiful thing. And I think often what happens for people, I've seen this a lot in the work that I've done with people, with parents, when they've had a sexual dynamic occur with their children earlier on, and they're going, "Is this okay? What happened? How do I
Mm,
make sense of this?" And again, it goes back to that concept of we see through the lens of our experiences, where often we've had woundedness that has happened sexually, and then we impose that on our children, and then they take our distorted lens as their own, and then they start to see their body as bad, or they start to see sexuality as bad, or nakedness as bad, or in the spiritual way, vulnerability, just emotional vulnerability is bad. Well, we don't talk about what's actually going on in our lives. Like, we hide that. We're not honest. These experiences get transmitted to our children. And it's been interesting, like I said last session, so much of the work that I used to do, or when I started out, I was working with children. And then I realized I can help way more kids if I help adults.
mhm.
By helping adults be healthy, I'm going to help a whole lot of kids just have a normal life, because their mom and dad and their brokenness, we impose stuff. And so instead of being seen rightly, we help people not see rightly.
And we impose that because of our shame.
Break that down a little bit.
Well, if you think about it, as if a child is naked and unashamed in their innocence, and we then see that through a filter of our own woundedness, there's an element of shame in that for us.
Mm.
It's like
Mhm.
our own shame about whatever those experiences are colors our perception of the innocence of the child, and now we put the shame on the child, and now the child then begins to take in shame from the
Wow.
parent.
So
That's the
true.
dynamic that happens all the time.
Yeah, I feel that as a parent. I can talk about a
Yeah,
long list of experiences where I've done that. And we do. So I just want to say to all the people listening out there, and to all of us who are parents, is that we're going to make mistakes. And I'm saying this personally and professionally, right? We're going to make mistakes. Just one little caveat is the repair done well is incredibly powerful. When we repair well, when we appropriately apologize, when we repair, when we seek to restore the relationship with our children, that has a great impact that can actually take a relationship further than if the dynamic hadn't happened in the beginning.
yeah,
So I just want to highlight that for folks, is that parents, if you're just going, "Oh my gosh, I've totally failed with my kids," seek to repair and restore.
yeah. As you
It-
say that, this is a little off topic, but it fits what you're saying. Very fond memories of me as a child when my dad would become impatient and have some kind of punishment, but he knew that he had lost his temper or something like that.
Mhm.
He would inevitably come in
Mhm.
if I'm over in timeout or something. He'd inevitably come in, sit next to me, be very warm, and ask me if I understood, and then apologize for losing his temper. And it just warmed my heart to my dad. Whatever had just happened was
Right.
gone because I felt my dad's love and presence there.
Yeah, where you maybe had felt ashamed because of his
Yes,
intensity,
yes, yes, yes,
he
yes,
entered back into it.
yes. And he felt ashamed because of his
Exactly.
intensity, and it healed both of our shame. Yeah.
Amen.
We haven't even talked
Amen.
about shame yet, but
I know. We just just coming right out. So again, some of the experiences of original nakedness, just where people aren't a threat.
yeah,
Oh, that just sounds wonderful. Where
yeah.
fear isn't dictating what we do or don't do. Fear of failure, or fear of attack, or fear of, walking down dark alleys, just all that kind of stuff.
I think of Saint John in one of his letters saying, "Perfect love casts out all fear," because fear has to do with condemnation.
Yeah, this original glory,
Yeah.
original nakedness, original innocence. I like to use the language. It's an original glory, because it's got all those other ones kind of infused into it. It's because original nakedness and naked without shame is relational again,
Mhm.
right? It's in relationship to yourself, to God, and to the other. Oh, that's freedom. This to me really captures what freedom is. And John Paul II actually says this experience, naked without shame, it's the key to understanding God's plan for humans.
Mm.
Talk about, like, he's saying, this is the lens that we need to look through if we're going to understand God's plan for humans. Freedom. That's what naked without shame means, is real, sincere freedom. So I don't know about you, Bob, but I don't unfortunately live a lot of my life in this original glory. I live a lot of my life in the experience of shame. But there's a lot of healing that's happened. And so I want to get into this experience of shame so we can maybe help people understand it and kind of talk about how to break it down. And we're going to use another quote here because to me, this quote captures human experience possibly better than a lot that are out there, even in the scriptures. And it's where God says, "Where are you?" Oh, that's a deep question in and of itself. But and then Adam responds, "I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid."
Yeah.
That alone helps me understand so much of what I experience every day and the day to day. So, anything that jumps out at you before we kind of break that down a little bit more? Any initial reactions?
Oh, so many. I tried to pick one. I was thinking back to I'm in 3rd grade, and we're
Mhm,
doing a French play. I have a French teacher, and we're doing a French play. And my brother's class comes in. My brother's 2 years older than me.
mhm,
And I say all of my lines in French without much confidence. I'm the
mm,
gendarme, I'm the bodyguard. Through the whole thing, I've got my arm up covering my face so nobody can see me, and I'm
mm,
barely audible
mm.
speaking the lines. And I don't know who else noticed it, I'm sure everybody, but my teacher just reamed me out after that, for putting my
Uh,
but just there I am in 8th grade. Why am I feeling so ashamed? Why am I feeling so ashamed of who I am and my speech and in front of my
right,
brother? It's like,
right.
what's that about? And then I
Yeah.
think about an experience in 6th grade where I'm singing with the class, and the
Mhm.
teacher asked me to sit down because I'm off key, you know? And then how
Mm,
long that the shame of my voice lasted. Like, I wouldn't sing anywhere for the next 20 years because of the
mm,
shame of that, and so how those kind of experiences can be so shaming, not to mention the experiences, where I hid someplace where I was wrong. I think about my brother and I smoking cigarettes in 1st grade. He was 3rd
mhm,
grade, I was 1st grade,
mm,
and him saying, "Don't tell mom and dad," and
yeah,
I wasn't gonna anyhow because I knew it was wrong, but
right.
you begin to hide,
Yeah.
and then I find Playboys in 3rd grade, begin to hide that. And I
Mm,
find, just the whole process of hiding. And so you put those 2 things together. I'm afraid of my voice being heard. I'm afraid of being seen. I'm afraid of being rejected, being ridiculed, all those experiences of shame. And I could just go on.
yeah. Talk about opening up the memory lane.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have the time to go through it, but I think something that we can maybe potentially bless our listeners with is to give them some categories about your examples that you shared there, and as well as Adam, I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. All those components, I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. They're in all your stories. They're in so many of our stories. And so the value of this is that it gives us the ability to understand what's going on in our hearts. And these categories are things that for you and I, we get into very regularly in the healing process. And
Mm,
so we want to offer those categories because this is the nuts and bolts of what when you're getting into a healing dynamic. This is the domains that you work in. And so the first one for me is the what I call just the experience, or other people might call the memory. And so for Adam there, the experience is he's in the garden and he's naked. So that's the basic data. For you, you were in class and you were speaking French, and your brother was there. That's the experience. And there's components of that experience if you peel back the layer. Ed Smith in transformation prayer therapy calls it the container, the
mm,
memory container, right? So many different ways that people describe it. But when people say, like, oh, I'm doing some memory work, or I'm going to work on a trauma, often we're just talking about an experience. But if we peel back the layer, I like to say to people, there's three things that are going on in those experiences that you have. And I call them, well, how do we get to it? I say, you need to do a TED talk. So you need to have a TED talk with yourself, or if I'm helping somebody, I do a TED talk with them. And so underneath that experience, there's three dynamics that are going on often. There's some others, but these are the three big ones. The T stands for thoughts, the E stands for emotions, and the D stands for desires. So as that's happening for Adam, his experience of being naked, he has a very strong emotion. I'm afraid. Now, he probably has all kinds of thoughts going on too. And for you, if we use your example, do you recall potentially what was going on there when you were either when you were singing or when you were speaking in the French play, like what your thoughts, emotions, desires were?
Well, I think I had some sense of embarrassment, obviously,
So feeling, that's an emotion.
self-consciousness, and I think that increased afterwards. I think it was
Gotcha.
greater after the correction from both of the teachers.
So that's a really good distinction. The experience part one is the actual happening, and then there's part two where the teacher shames you, right?
Yeah,
So it could be, and I know you've seen this all the time, is that sometimes the original, what we call wound, isn't necessarily as potent as the what we might call the wound that comes after, right? Where the teacher shaming, sometimes that's more intense for people.
yeah,
It's not the original thing, and they go, "Oh, the play, that's what really got me." That
y
could be with the teacher.
yeah, I've had so many people in therapy tell me about sexual play as a child, and they were unself-conscious about it until an adult came in and went, "Oh," and then made
Right,
a huge deal, and then it was that experience that brought the incredible shame there.
right.
Not that there wasn't some inherent shame in the experience, but it was mostly brought in afterwards.
Absolutely. So if we continue on with your experience there in the French play, is that you would have had all kinds of thoughts going on, as simple or as complex, like, especially with the teacher one. I'm dumb. I got this wrong. Whatever these thoughts that were going on, but you also had desires like I want to be safe. I want to be okay. I don't want to be in trouble. Like these aches that would have happened in your heart. So there's kind of two categories right out of the bat: the experience of the memory and TED, these little TED dynamics.
Uh-huh.
Now, I'm going to go through the next three pretty simply and quickly so that we can kind of keep moving along. But this next one to me is a big one. And I call it beliefs. In other words, it's how we take up all the dynamics and we put them into a simple statement. This is just basic neurology. We can't remember every single little fact, every single little thing. We generalize it, we synthesize it. So for you, when you were there and the teacher shamed you, you would have come to some belief about maybe speaking French or being in front of people or your voice. Do you remember maybe what that was? What belief you came to or the lie?
I don't remember in the situation, but what comes to mind right now is I'm bad. That's
So
that's
that
a
would be,
shame word.
yeah,
I'm
I'm
bad.
bad.
Yeah,
And what's interesting is you might have done the French perfectly,
yeah,
but she got on to you because of how you held your hand over your head because you had a emotion, a powerful emotion going on, and then she shamed you, and then you concluded, "I'm bad,"
yeah,
right?
yeah.
The next thing that comes after beliefs or lies are vows. What's a vow, and how did you notice it in that experience?
Again, not conscious of it in that experience, but I kept speaking French, so it wasn't that I'll never speak French again. It took 8 years more of that.
Maybe you liked her, didn't
Maybe
like
that
her.
was the vows, I'm gonna get this right.
Yeah.
I can't speak it. Uh,
Oh, that's
but,
great.
I think maybe as I'm not gonna put myself out there to be embarrassed, it's probably because I know in high school I wouldn't dance in front of anybody. I wouldn't dance, period, or, I
Yeah, yeah.
wouldn't sing. So, I think the combination of those things is I'm not gonna be exposed in
Right.
order to be ashamed. So, I'm gonna
Yeah.
pull back and protect myself.
Yeah, and that's exactly what a vow is just this thing that we do to react to the belief. So if I'm bad, I will not blank or I will blank. And so this is what we're seeing here for Adam is that he's afraid, that's his emotion, because he's naked, that's his experience. And so he hides. So he goes, I will not let myself be seen. I will pull away. And his attempt is to get safe. He's trying to fulfill that desire of safety and intimacy. It's just the way he's going about it, it's not going to work. It doesn't work. And so these basic categories: experience, TED, thoughts, emotions, desires, beliefs or lies, and vows. You can see these categories in almost every area of a wound or an experience. And I don't know about you, Bob, but these are the areas that I work in when I'm working with people in an intense memory.
Absolutely. As you're saying that, I'm thinking of so many experiences, and it's so fulfilling. Again, what's the redemption? The redemption is Jesus' love. Uh,
Amen.
John 3:17. I did not come to condemn the world, but to save it. But this is the condemnation: men love darkness more than light, because their
Mm,
deeds were evil. But anybody who comes in the light will have their deeds exposed. And so, a lot of healing
mhm.
is just bringing those places of shame to somebody who's gonna not condemn us, but that's gonna love us and see us and bring light there, help us bring Jesus light, bring us into communion with Jesus there. And I think about so many experiences. One that's really sticking in my mind right now
Mhm.
is a woman who had been in lesbianism for years.
Mhm.
And she had come out of lesbianism and come out of the whole lifestyle and had really grown in her faith, but she had never gone back and talked about the shame that she experienced in the depths of those experiences. And so she's communicating and trusting bit by bit by bit, more and more of the experiences, more and more really unpleasant, shameful experiences that she's describing. And I'll never forget, as she's so filled with shame, as she's getting to the deepest, most painful, most shameful experiences, I said to her, just, if you will, just look at my eyes and don't see me, just see Jesus for a minute.
Mm.
And she transformed in that moment. It was just the most incredible thing. I really believe Jesus was doing something in it, but it was
Mm.
like she could see Jesus's love, compassion through my eyes and
Mhm.
know that this place where she had hated herself, felt so much shame, was
Wow.
penetrated in love, and she was free. And it was really a huge turning point.
Wow. And that's an experience of love in our shame.
Yes.
And you know what's amazing about that, to use this concept that is really riddled throughout Adam's story there and your and my story, everybody's story, is this concept of fig leaves. This
Yeah.
how we hide. And in that moment, she took off the fig leaf of how she protected her wounds and then let you see her.
Yes. You know, here's the thing, and I don't know if you experienced this, but I've had so many people say to me, "Well, I went to confession and I confessed it, and that really helped,
Mhm.
but why am I still carrying shame?
Mm.
Why am I still holding on to the shame? Why can't I get free of this?" And it's actually, as we know, the shame continues the compulsion. And so
Mm.
I can't get free of this compulsion, even though I keep getting forgiveness, and I keep feeling more shame because I keep getting forgiveness.
Right.
You know,
And not getting better.
this goes back to your testimony that you shared.
Yeah.
And what I found is that there's 2 parts. There's forgiveness, and then there's
Mm.
bringing the depths of the shame out into the light. So
Mm.
very rarely in confession do people confess the depths of their shame. They just confess the sin, but shame is the effect of that sin
Right.
or the effect of the self-rejection in the sin
Right.
or the hiding in the sin or the self-condemnation, and all that needs to come out. That's why healing is so essential there.
It's so true. You know, like you said, it's not super common. And this is something I try to help the seminarians that I am involved with their formation, is that when they're in the sacrament of confession, it's literally called a sacrament of healing.
Mhm.
That's its categorization by the church. And so if you can be, by the grace of the sacrament, in any way facilitating healing, do it, man. Like, go for it. Honor the right, but there's space and place for you to facilitate healing that is in union with the sacrament. And I found that priests that have been able to integrate that, boy, when you go to confession to them, it's transformational, because not only do they offer forgiveness, but through their person, through their being in persona Christi, they also allow you to experience, after having shared these really vulnerable things, that they're loved.
I think both of us in our conferences have experienced that one because these priests have been immersed in this understanding. People come to the conferences, they go to confession with priests who've been trained this way, and they said, "This is the best confession of my entire life. I'm just so free in a way that I've never been free before."
Yeah. To be honest, I've also heard of priests who, I think because of their own brokenness, God bless them, that when they sense and see other people's vulnerability, they end up shaming the sinner.
Yeah.
And it often comes out of their own wound. You know, they don't often even see it themselves. And then people have these really negative experiences. And that's what's going on, is they're taking off the fig leaves in the confessional or in a counseling session. And they want to be seen rightly, right? They want light to come in, but not to destroy them. They want light to come in to warm them, to bring life back to them. And that's really what we are when we love as Christ loves. You know, that's the call of all of us. You know, so maybe we'll get into a little bit with healing. I have to say that, Bob, I'm a big Bishop Barron fan.
Yeah.
Like,
Me too.
boy, he is just incredible. So it wasn't long ago where on the Sunday where he's talking about the road to Emmaus,
Yeah.
he actually linked the Garden of Eden and the story of Emmaus. And this is exactly what we're talking about. And I thought, this is an incredibly brilliant realization of how healing happens. And it's exactly what we're talking about bringing light in. So I'm just going to quickly kind of go through the comparisons and let people see it. I think one of the first things that is important is that for both the Garden of Eden and for Jerusalem, the two guys who left Jerusalem and are walking to Emmaus, they both left the places where life was. The Garden of Eden is where life was. That was kind of the centerpiece of life. In Jerusalem, that's where life was. That's where the transformation happens. That's where like the center of the salvific acts of God occurred. And symbolically, they're leaving that. They're walking away from it. And this is the most beautiful part of it. In both scenarios, God comes after them. So in our healing journey, the thing that we have to realize, just as the Catechism talks about with prayer, is that God is always the first pursuer. Everything we're doing is always a response. So Jesus pursues these guys as they're walking away from the shame of his death, from the shame of having been a follower of his. And the crazy thing is, in Eden, the experience of shame is huge. They see themselves, I'm afraid because I'm naked, so I hid. That's like the hiding. It's so intense. We've been doing that for millennia, the shame. And so they're ashamed of themselves and they're ashamed of God, Adam and Eve. And so in Emmaus, God comes up to these guys and meets them in their shame, and he opens their eyes and feeds them. And that's where the story goes. First, he opens their eyes to the story. And that's very much of what happens in the healing journey is our eyes are open to the story of what happened to us. And sometimes that's hard. It's like, I don't really want to see the reality of what occurred there, but our eyes being open is all part of the healing process. And then the shame is entered. And then in the Emmaus story, he feeds them with his presence. So their eyes are opened and they realize his presence right in the midst of them as it's centering around the celebration of Mass, where it's centering around him giving himself to them to satisfy their hunger and their ache. And that's what healing is. Our eyes being opened, and the Lord entering into that space and giving us himself to satisfy the deepest aches of our hearts and also to remove the lies. That was what was going on when he opened up the scriptures for them.
Wow.
That's not true. This is true. That's not true. This is true. Have faith, brothers, have faith. And here's the beautiful part is once they experience that, their eyes being opened, an experience of Jesus in the memory and in their shame, they turn back and they go back to Jerusalem. They're back on mission. They're back as they were intended to be. And that's exactly, healing's not supposed to be the entirety of our life in the sense of all I do in the Christian journey is work on healing. No, we have a mission, and that's to live out our call and our identity with the Lord. And healing is something that helps us live that out more fully and more real. So a lot of that is Bishop Barron's insight
Yeah.
and me just kind of pulling out the healing components of
Yeah.
it. But
Yeah, that's incredible, isn't it?
it was beautiful.
Yeah.
What about for you when you think about healing of shame or in that scripture or whatever? What comes to mind?
Well, I think going a couple days earlier from the story you just told, that's Jesus being stripped and then hung on the cross naked and
Wow.
humiliated and coming into the world naked and leaving the world naked. And I just think there's something in that where he's being publicly humiliated and condemned and
Mm,
shamed by almost everybody around him, where he is breaking the power of shame. You know, it's only, I think, when we walk into the woundedness, when
mm,
we walk into the shame and
mm,
experience the truth of who we are in that, truth of our identity in that, that healing happens. And so Jesus does that for us because he walked it himself. You know, it's like he walked through that place himself without taking in the lies that you described, without taking in the beliefs that you described, without hiding, you know, without pulling back, without making vows. It's like he is the picture of redemption. And, you know, as the Catechism says, everything that Jesus went through is a model and a participation for us, so that he's the first to bring us through in those places.
You know what strikes me about that is it links me back to identity, where Jesus on the cross in that space, I often ask myself, how in the world did he do it? How am I supposed to live like that? In that depth of humiliation? There's been times and pockets where I've experienced humiliation and nothing like that, but man, it felt pretty intense. And just as you said that, as I pictured the scene, I love the images of the crucifixion where Jesus' head is lifted up to the heavens.
Mm.
So, in the midst of his being humiliated by those who are below, he's in this tension of in between, which is exact. I know that tension of being pulled down in shame or being lifted up in my identity as a son with the Father.
Mhm.
And what Jesus is making a conscious choice to do is to choose the identity of sonship. Even though it seems like the Father's abandoned him, he's saying, no, I'm a son. I'm a son, and I'm a son or I'm a daughter. You know, if you're a female,
Yeah.
I'm watching him go, oh, that's how I navigate shame. It's with ultimate trust in my loving Father that he's going to bring about a deeper redemption. And that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, and now it was beautiful, and now we've come full circle because we started off with identity, right, and who we are before the Father, and it's really the way that we heal is, and it's right in the places of our shame. Our shame doesn't define us.
Mhm.
Whatever those experiences are, whatever those memories are, whatever the sin is, whatever the habitual patterns are, that's not our identity. You know, St. Paul says, "Is it is not I who does it, but it's the sin that dwells in me." He was able to separate his identity from his sin. Too oftentimes we see ourselves through our sin. You know, John Paul II, we are not the sum of our weaknesses and failures, we're the sum of the Father's love for us. And so that identity, looking up to the Father, is always the way to heal shame. And it's always the way that we get safe enough to be naked about the places of our shame.
Amen. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there in that scene of Our Lady supporting
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
So the earthly supports John and Our Lady supporting that, but ultimately the healing is coming from God, which is what, we started with Pope Benedict,
yeah.
all healing that comes from Jesus.
And seeing people in their wholeness.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so these are the practicals. What just happened there for me is I'm just picturing the scene
yeah,
and I'm trying to look at the scene and going, what can this teach me? What is the Lord trying to show me just in the picture? And then the second place is enter into that scene. I also have been taught to, if you get little, then you can find nooks and crannies all over that crucifixion where you can rest. And you just get to rest. Maybe it's right next to him on his shoulder, or you get to rest and be little. You can enter into his side. You can find these places in him in that crucifixion where he will take it all for you.
yeah,
He'll take all of the dynamics for you because you're little enough. If I'm gigantic, then and I'm a visual guy, I'm like, I'm too big. I can't find a spot where I can be there with him. But if I'm little enough, Mary can just hold me right there with him. Or I can find a spot and I can rest there as he does all the work. What about a practical for you? Would you say that it's important for our listeners
yeah.
maybe to look into?
What's been helpful, very helpful for me, is life confession, of really
Mm,
looking back through my life and the things that I've been afraid to look at and just naming them. And then finding, for me, it's a priest, in the 12 steps, it's just somebody that is
yeah,
sponsor or somebody like that. But just finding somebody that I can trust that will walk with me through all of those areas.
yeah,
And, I've done that sometimes with priests and they've been disinterested and it doesn't have the same power as if somebody's really engaged with you
yeah,
and they're walking with you in it. And I've had both experiences.
yeah.
But there's a book by Father William Watson, Father Bill Watson, who's a Jesuit from Seattle,
Mhm,
and it's a book on whole life confession. And so
mhm.
that might be a good resource.
Yeah,
And it's just really valuable just to look at the things that are shameful and bring them out into the light and look at them in the light of his mercy and his love.
yeah. The simple question that you're saying there is, where am I afraid to invite Jesus into?
Yeah.
And what's the belief I have there? What's the vow I have there? Am I willing to bring that to Jesus, invite Jesus into the belief, into that? And a practical for our Catholic brothers and sisters, book an appointment for that one. Most priests really
Yeah.
appreciate not happening
Not
on
in
a
the line.
Saturday. Yeah, they're like,
Yeah.
"Oh boy, I wish you'd have let me know." And
Yeah.
I found that that's a helpful thing. Find a priest who loves you, and then give him a phone call and say, "Hey, I heard on this podcast about doing a general confession. Could I set that up with you?"
Yeah, and
Um,
if people want a little aid, if it's in the area of sexual sin, in our Holy Desire workbook, we have a really detailed questionnaire that goes into the depths of all of those things. Sometimes that kind of an aid helps. And when we do this with priests and seminarians, it really helps just to draw out the areas of shame.
Man, there's so much more where that comes from. And that's, where we're headed with the podcast is just, blessing you with resources. So just to further that, right, you can go to Bob's website. So you can go check that out, and we'll put all this in the show notes. And Bob's talks on YouTube. You can find my resources on my website, liferestoration.ca, and just all kinds of stuff out there. And we're continuing to build up our website with just various resources, and they're for you to kind of continue on in the healing journey. So Bob, any kind of final thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, I think this is our last one on the theology of the body, right?
I think so.
And so
Yeah.
I think it was good that we came back full circle with identity, and that where we get that is from the Father, and it's the way is that communion, that restoration.
Yeah. Well, thanks for listening. As you heard, you can find more about us on our websites. Those will all be in the show notes, and you can find all of our episodes on our iTunes or other places that you find podcasts, or you can go right to our website for this podcast, which is restoretheglorypodcast.com. God bless you, and we pray that you would experience the abundance of God's love, mercy, and healing.